I recently asked the members of the English Pro Tips Facebook group, which part of the speaking test do you find most difficult? Part 1, Part 2, or Part 3? Now, as you can see, most people said Part 3 is the most difficult. And to be honest, I agree. So in today's video, we're going to be looking at some tips and strategies to help you prepare and perform at your best in Part 3 of the speaking test. Now, when I asked the students what they find so difficult about Part 3, they said this: I can't think of ideas. So the examiner asks you a question and your mind goes blank. You can't think of what to say. A total nightmare scenario. Okay, so to help you with that, we're going to be looking at some tips for what we can do before the test, so in our preparation period, and during Part 3 of the speaking test. Okay, so first of all, what can we do when we're preparing? Well, first of all, we can practice speaking about common IELTS topics. Okay, so the common topics that appear regularly in IELTS are things like the environment, geography, which includes buildings, cities, travel. For example, public transport is a very common topic that appears all the time in IELTS. Education, skills and learning. People, which includes upbringing, so for example parenting, health and happiness also, and work and the economy. Okay, so to help you with these common topics, I've prepared a blog post where I look at some difficult Part 3 questions related to these topics, and what you can do is go through them with a teacher or a partner and ask each other these kinds of questions, and then get your partner to ask why as a follow-up question to get you to develop your ideas more, a bit like in the real test. Okay, so first tip, practice speaking about common IELTS topics. The second tip is to learn vocabulary for these common topics. Now, typically when we have more vocabulary about a common topic or about a topic in general, we find it easier to explain and think of ideas related to that topic. It's a bit like if you're interested in sport, or you talk about sport regularly in your English, for example, it's going to be much easier to talk about sports. However, if you don't really ever discuss the environment and you don't know vocabulary related to the environment, if you get asked about the environment, it's going to be much more difficult to think of ideas and have the vocabulary to communicate those ideas. Okay, so on my website, englishprotips.com, I've got a vocabulary course, and we look at the common topics and look at some high-level words related to each of the common topics that appear in IELTS. And I put a link to that in the description below. Now, the third tip is to watch IELTS speaking tests, particularly speaking tests with high-level students, so students that are getting Band 7, Band 8, or even Band 9. Now, one of the members of English Pro Tips has a very good learning strategy. What they do is they go and they find these videos, so high-level speaking tests on YouTube, and they look at Part 3, and after the examiner asks a question, they pause the video, they answer the question, and then afterwards they press play and they watch how the high-level student answers the question. And then as they do this more regularly, they find it easier to answer common questions that appear in IELTS, and they also learn high-level vocabulary for those common questions. So that's a very good way to prepare yourself for Part 3. Okay, we also have some tips for during Part 3 of the speaking test. Now, the first one is stay calm. Remember, it's not what you say, but how you say it. The examiner doesn't necessarily have to agree with your ideas, and they're not assessing you on whether they agree with your ideas. It's how you explain those ideas. So even if you say, for example, I don't know, for example, as an answer to a question, and you explain why you don't know, you can still get a high score for that because you're using high-level vocabulary to explain why you don't know the answer to a question. So remember, it's the language, not the ideas, that you're being evaluated on. However, we can come up with better ideas in part 3 by using different approaches. For example, the multiple perspectives approach. Okay, so I'm going to explain that in a bit more detail. Imagine if you get a question like this. Is it a good thing that many people own their own private cars? Okay, this is a very typical part 3 question. Now we can use the multiple perspectives approach to make a more developed, rich answer. And I'll show you what I mean. We could say something like this. For the people who own the car, maybe it's more convenient for them. They can travel from one place to another very easily. From an economic perspective, it can be very good for the economy because people are buying expensive products, cars, and also they're able to move around the country more easily. Okay, so do you see we've got the perspective of people who own the cars, we've got the perspective from the economy, and we can also have another perspective in terms of the effect on the environment. So in terms of the effect on the environment, people owning private cars is not a good thing because there'll be more gas emissions that are going into the ozone layer. Okay, so do you see we're making a more developed answer by replying or answering from different perspectives. We could also mention the perspective of people who can't afford their own private cars. Okay, so the multiple perspectives approach is an advanced way to make sure that you have a fully developed answer. Okay, so we said stay calm, answer from the multiple perspectives approach, and the third thing is answer from your knowledge and experience, and I'll show you what I mean. Is it a good thing that many people own their own private cars? Well, you could say, well, from my experience, or the people who I know, or I can't speak for everyone, however, many of the people around me, or most of my friends. So what you're doing is you're taking a broad question and you're breaking it down, you're making it easier to answer by talking about your knowledge and your experience of this question. I hope that makes sense. Okay, now tip number 2 is these 2 magic words. It depends. Okay, I'll show you what I mean. Look at this question. Is protecting the environment more important than economic growth? Are smartphones good for productivity? Do parents or teachers have more influence on young people? Okay, well, the answer to all of these is, it depends. And you can say that in the IELTS speaking test, and I'll show you what I mean. So, do parents or teachers have more influence on young people? So we could say, well, it depends on how much time the children spend with their parents. If the parents are constantly working and absent from their children's childhood, then they're not going to have such a large influence on their children. And maybe teachers will have a larger influence. However, if parents are very involved in their children's upbringing, then they're going to have a larger influence on their children. So do you see the way we can say it depends on, and then the important thing is we elaborate on what it depends on. So we could also say things like, one consideration is, or I think we need to take into account. So these are all similar to it depends on, or I would say, so you could say, I would say that parents have a larger influence on children. However, it also depends on how regularly and how much time they spend with their children. Okay, so it depends on is very useful, especially for part 3 of the speaking test, where you get a lot of questions that aren't necessarily black or white. So there's no clear answer. It depends on particular conditions. Now remember, a good idea is to point out those conditions with a phrase like, it depends on. Okay, number 3. Elaborate on your answers. Something that's very important for getting those Band 7, Band 8 and Band 9 scores. Now, to elaborate on your answers, I always suggest the REE method. Okay, so REE stands for respond, elaborate, example. And I'll show you what I mean. take this question. Do parents or teachers have more influence on young people? So first of all, you respond. You say something like, I would say that parents have more influence on young people. And then, after we've responded, we elaborate. To begin with, in most families, parents will spend more cumulative time with their children than teachers. Okay, so we've elaborated on our response. And now the final E is we give an example. For example, children will only really spend time with their teachers while they're at school. However, they'll often be with their parents before school, after school, at the weekend and on holiday. As a result, parents end up spending a lot more time with children, and therefore they're more likely to have an influence on their children. Okay. Now, if we want to develop our ideas further, we can combine the REE method with the multiple perspectives approach, and then we can also say something like that. Saying that, I can also see why some people think that teachers have a lot of influence on young people. So now we're giving the alternative side. Our teachers often shape our idea of the world. For example, a politics teacher and the books that they give us to read will often influence the way that we view the political system in our country. Likewise with history. Okay, so we use the REE method and to give one alternative, and then we can start the REE method again to explain the other alternative. And by organizing your ideas in this way, you're going to come up with a more rich and developed answer, which can help you get a higher score in IELTS speaking. Okay, now the fourth tip is this: don't focus on yourself. Okay, so remember there are 3 parts of the speaking test. In part 1, you're asked questions about yourself. In part 2, you speak for 2 minutes. And in part 3, you're asked questions about your opinions. Okay, so in part 3, the part that we're looking at today, you're not going to be asked personal questions about you. And I'll show you an example. Do parents or teachers have more influence on young people? What do you think of this answer? Well, my parents had a very large influence on me because... No, we don't like that because it's focusing on ourselves, which we don't want to do in part 3. We want to focus on people in general, or parents and teachers in general. So we could say this: parents have a large influence on young people because... And do you see the slight difference between these two answers? One is focusing on ourselves, and we don't want to do that. The other one is focusing on our ideas and opinions, and we do want to do that. Okay. Finally, don't worry if you don't know the answer to a question. Like I said earlier, the examiner's more interested in the language you use than the ideas that you explain. So, if you get this question again, do parents or teachers have more influence on young people? You could say something like, I've never really considered that, I guess. And then the important thing is you attempt to give an answer anyway. So you say, I don't really know, but, and then you try and give your answer anyway. And that's the important thing. You don't just say, I don't really know, and then wait for the next question, because that's going to lower your score dramatically. You could also say, I don't know if I'm the right person to ask, but I'd say, or, tricky question, I reckon, or interesting question, I think, and then you begin to give your answer anyway. Okay, now the final thing that we're going to do today is look at some frequently asked questions about part 3 of the speaking test. So one question that I get quite regularly is, why does the examiner interrupt me? Okay, so the examiner doesn't intend to be rude when they interrupt you. You imagine they've got a lot of questions that they need to get through in quite a short period of time. Remember, speaking tests are only 11 to 14 minutes, and they have many questions that they want to ask you in order to understand your level. So they need to move through the test. And as a result, they might stop you and move on to the next question. So if an examiner interrupts you, don't worry. It's not a reflection of you. It's the fact that they need to get through lots of questions in the test. Okay, which part of the speaking test is the most important? Okay, so there is no most important part of the speaking test. The examiner is going to be looking at your speaking in part 1, part 2 and part 3, and then they're going to be giving you a score based on your performance in each part of the speaking test. Okay, so it's important to do well in all parts of the speaking test. Remember, if you want more help with part 1 or part 2 of the speaking test, then check out my tips for those parts. I'll put a link in the description below. What should I say at the end of the test? Okay, so at the end of the test, the examiner will say something like, "Thank you very much, that is the end of the speaking test." And you can just say, "Thank you very much." Okay, can I ask for feedback after the test? No, you cannot. You can't ask for feedback and you cannot ask for your score. Or rather, you shouldn't ask for feedback and you shouldn't ask for your score. The examiner isn't allowed to give you feedback, and you'll get your score for your speaking, your writing, your listening and your reading all at the same time, usually around 7 days after your final test. And finally, should I shake hands with the examiner? No, you shouldn't initiate shaking hands with the examiner. In some countries, examiners might shake hands with you, but you should always let them initiate shaking hands with you. You shouldn't try and shake hands with the examiner. And definitely don't try to hug them either. Okay, I hope this has been useful, and best of luck with your IELTS speaking test. Keep me informed, let me know in the comment section how do you get on with your speaking test, and tell me, are any of these tips useful for you? Okay, see you in the next lesson. Bye then.